The biggest transfer in the history of devolution, or the biggest power grab since the launch of the Scottish Parliament. The Westminster Government has published its plans to ensure seamless trade across the UK after the Brexit transition period. This programme spoke to UK Business Secretary Alex Sharma about it yesterday.
All devolved policy areas will stay devolved. There will be the biggest transfer of powers in the history of devolution at the end of the transition period. And this will mean that, the government in Scotland, where it has policy areas which intersects with their competence, will be able to set their own rules. This is a power surge, not a power grab.
Well, an hour later, we heard the Scottish Government's view from Mike Russell.
These aren't new powers for the Scottish Parliament. That is actually, I'm sorry to call it this, a lie. There are other pieces in it that simply aren't true also. Renewable energy, we've got the largest renewable energy, one of the largest in Europe. So there are other things that they're actually trying to take away by framework, things like chemical regulation. So the list is wrong, the list is a misrepresentation, and nobody should be fooled about it.
So which is it? Well, Aileen McHarg is Professor of Public Law and Human Rights at the University of Durham and joins us now. Morning, Aileen.
Good morning.
So what is going on here? Is it possible to put the politics to one side and look at the law and see, is this a power surge? Are more powers coming to the devolved nations? Or is it, as they claim, a power grab?
Well, it's what is being proposed is a new, what you might call cross-cutting constraint on decision-making by the devolved legislatures and devolved governments. So at the moment, they are subject to a duty to legislate and to make decisions in accordance with EU law. That obligation will fall away at the end of this year. What the white paper is proposing is a new obligation to legislate, to decide in accordance with a new market access commitment. So this is a new constraint which will replace the current constraint imposed by EU law. The difficulty is that the new constraint is unlikely to be the same as the constraint imposed by EU law. It looks like, although the details are not entirely clear, it looks like it will be broader in its application, and we don't yet know exactly how it will operate. So to take an example, you're probably aware a few years ago there was an attempted challenge to the Scottish Parliament's minimum alcohol unit pricing legislation on the basis that that was contrary to EU law. That challenge was ultimately unsuccessful because the court said the legislation was for a health purpose and that overrode any impact on competition. We just don't know yet at the moment whether there will be the same possibility under the new proposals for the devolved parliaments to override these new cross-cutting internal market constraints.
So potentially it could threaten devolution then?
Potentially it could. I mean, it also looks like it's going to cover a wider range of policy areas. Something that struck me in the white paper was a reference to problems caused by differential building regulations, that if there are different building regulations in England and Scotland, that could cause problems for seamless trade. But of course, there have been differences in building regulations between Scotland and England as long as there have been building regulations, and that's not something that was ever caught by EU law. So it looks like this is going to apply more broadly. And as I say, we don't know yet exactly how it's going to operate, how it's going to be enforced. We don't have any details of the new subsidy control framework that's going to accompany this market access commitment. So it's all very unclear.
Yeah, because Scottish ministers say that standards here across the country could be dragged down, could be less if the UK government makes concessions in new trade deals. So that would involve, for example, food from the United States. So could it end up being then that Scotland would have to accept lower standards on something like food safety?
Well, this is the other way in which these proposals differ from EU law. So EU law applies in a symmetrical way across both the devolved parliaments and the UK Parliament. But these new proposals will not in practice be binding on the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament is sovereign, and so it can always escape from any obligations it imposes on itself, and the white paper anyway says explicitly that certain areas will not be covered. So there's a concern, because one of the things that's going to be required is something called mutual recognition. If goods or services are authorised or are lawful in one part of the UK, then they can be lawfully sold or provided in any other part of the UK. Now, the difficulty is, because England is so large and so dominant, that means that anything produced in England in accordance with English standards can be supplied in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. And because the UK Parliament legislates for England, because it's not in practice bound by any ultimate guarantees, then English standards in practice are likely to prevail. The white paper contains lots of high-sounding commitments to high regulatory standards, but there are simply no guarantees that that will be the case in the future.
What options then, if any, are open now to the Scottish Government if it wishes to legally challenge the plans? Does the Scotland Act come into play here?
Well, I don't think there is any real opportunity for legal challenge. This is going to require primary legislation for the UK Parliament. It will be subject to the Sewell Convention, and it is, of course, it's very likely that devolved consent will be withheld, at least in Scotland and Wales. But we've seen in recent years that the UK Parliament is willing to ignore a lack of devolved consent in relation to Brexit bills. So I think there is not very much that the devolved governments can do other than protest about this.
Right, so you don't think that there's anything they can do. And in terms of timescale then, what do you think is likely to happen here?
Well, the timescale is a huge problem. There is 4 weeks for consultation over these proposals, which is extremely short. A standard consultation period would be 3 months, and of course this is 4 weeks in July and August, so when people are on holiday. So very, very short period. And that seems very difficult to justify, given that we've been talking about these internal market issues since at least the beginning of 2017. So it's not that nobody's known that this was an issue that was coming. So we've got a very short period. As I said, there's lots that's not clear in these proposals at the moment. And then legislation is to be in place by the end of the year. So there is not very much time for discussion and negotiation to make changes to these proposals.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us this morning. That was Aileen McHarg there, Professor of Public Law and Human Rights at the University of Durham.